So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our keynote speaker. And Mark Pesce is one of those guys that might look familiar to you because he's been on television and he's currently on a podcast that you'll be able to tune into and see as well. Mark is an inventor, he's an author, he's an educator, and he's a broadcaster. He's best known for co-inventing VRML. Any ideas? That is virtual reality modelling language. And of course. And Mark has written 6 books, founded postgraduate programs in interactive media at both the University of Southern California and the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and for 7 years appeared as a panellist on the ABC's The New Inventors program. Mark currently hosts This Week in Startups Australia, which has rapidly become Australia's #1 tech podcast and well worth a look. And ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome Mark Pesce.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to modulate back and forth around both sides of this pole. I hope that's going to be okay. So, disruption, which is now getting to be, everyone starts to cringe a little bit. What does it mean? Why does it mean? Why are we being hammered to death with disruption? What I want to do is I actually want to dig underneath, because there's actually a layer underneath disruption that's driving disruption. And if we take a look at that layer, then we understand how to make disruption work for us. Disruption. The world is changing so fast right now. It's kind of like you're driving down the highway and you look in the rearview mirror and you see this big truck and it's way off in the distance, and then you look away again because you're driving, you look back, and all of a sudden this huge truck has zoomed up in the rearview mirror. It's bearing down on us at 150 k's an hour. We're wondering whether we're going to get sucked underneath it and never seen again. That's one way of taking a look at the world. The other way we can take a look at that world is that as that truck pulls by us, we can actually get into the slipstream behind that truck and use the acceleration to power us along. What I want to do is start off with taking a look at what's been happening to us. We're going to start with what's happening to us and use that as a foundation to understand what's been happening to the rest of the world. Now, the big thing here is that we're starting to get a lot smarter. And I want to point this out very simply. I moved to this country in 2003, 14 years ago. Within the first fortnight of living in Sydney, my friends had invited me out for a very important night of pub trivia. It was marvelous. We sat around a table, we drank beers, we missed the meat tray by this much. It was a beautiful tradition. I looked forward to doing it for many years in Australia. In 2017, if you want to play pub trivia, you have to strip yourself naked and play it in a bunker underground, well away from all of the mobile broadband. I could give you one example of how much the world has changed in the last 14 years. I would tell you that the knowledge culture that we built and we're inside of broke pub trivia. And we can have a moment to feel sad for pub trivia, which is never really going to be the same anymore. We can. We can also glory in the fact that all of us are walking around with a device in our pocket now that is connected to the fact that we have spent the last 25 years sharing every bit of information that we know, putting it up online where Google goes and indexes it so that we can then, anytime we have a question about anything, pull the phone out of our pocket and get the answer to that question. This is the actual mechanism that broke pub trivia. On the other hand, we basically have all of human knowledge at the end of our hands all of the time now. And we made this transition kind of seamlessly. It was like, oh, this is really nice. And it's only when you're taking a look at the wreckage of pub trivia that you go, not only is this nice, but this has really changed the way that we operate. And what I want to do is sort of take a look at that. What did that mean? What did that do? Now, as we all know, Australia does not have the greatest wired broadband in the world. That's another matter. The upside of this, the silver lining in this cloud, is that we have the third best wireless broadband network in the world. All right, I think Finland and Singapore are the only places that actually do better than us on this league charts. And we now have all of that broadband coming into our very whizzy smartphones. So we now actually have this incredible capacity as an unwired culture to be able to use knowledge and manage knowledge from wherever we are. And this is not just amazing for us as grown-ups. I want you to think about this. 6-year-old entering year 1. Going to school. From the time they could recognize what was going on, when mom or dad had a question they needed to answer, what did they see mom and dad do? Saw mom and dad take a smartphone out of their pocket and tap at it for a little bit and have the answer and then go on. And so we're now putting kids into school with a completely different sense of where knowledge comes from and how they acquire it and what they do with it. This is the other side of it. So not only did we break pub trivia over the last 14 years, we kind of broke the entire way we think about knowledge. And kids are now entering the school system in Australia and in the rest of the world, but particularly in Australia, with a very different idea of where knowledge comes from and how we use knowledge. That change isn't trivial. Now, what does this mean? It means, in the best case, every time that we have a decision that we need to make, we can be informed by the best knowledge on that topic. We have a lot of different opinions. We might want to synthesize those opinions. We might want to spend some time with them. I know that when I go shopping for an appliance these days, I do this with smartphone in hand, and I go and look at the reviews for anything before I buy it. I bought a whizzy new TV a couple of weeks ago, and I was looking at the reviews as I was making the decision whether I was going to buy the Sony or whether I was going to buy the Samsung, based on the fact that a bunch of people had a bunch of opinions and I could get to those opinions instantly. So I was functioning not in a knowledge vacuum, but with the best information and the experience of other people. And we can do that with pretty much any decision of consequence we make. Now, we don't always do that. We sometimes just stumble off and make decisions on our own, but we can do that. And what we need to think about now is how to bridge the gap between the fact that we can do it and the fact that we may want to be doing that more. And some of that's just because it's kind of hard. And what we're going to talk about is how that's going to start to get easier. So we know this is the world that we're in now. I want to talk about why we ended up in this world. And this comes back to 1989. And this fellow named Tim Berners-Lee, you saw me hugging in the first slide up there. He's a software engineer at CERN, which is the big atom smasher over in Geneva, who was trying to figure out how to solve a problem they had over there, because they'd have all these scientists come from all over the world, smash some atoms, and then they'd have to distribute the results back to all of those scientists on all these different labs with all of these different computers, none of which talk to one another. And he came up with this very clever idea to design a common framework to let all of these computers talk to one another, hand it off to his boss, who writes, and you need to see it, this is the actual paper, vague but interesting, was the feedback from his boss. That's the paper that created the World Wide Web. So that's 1989, just this idea that you can connect and share the information across all of these computers. Now, I saw this sort of fairly early on. I was one of the first people to start working on the web back in the early 1990s. I remember the first time I played with the web. It was in early 1993. And I went up and said, okay, I can see you can click on these links, but there's not much here. It's really not very useful. It's not even a particularly good toy. And I missed the point of the web, because the web wasn't just this way to connect computers together. It was an open system for sharing information. Anyone could add their own information to the web completely freely. Anyone could do this as much as they wanted. So anyone could set up a web server. Anyone could create a web page. So what it wasn't just a technology, it was an invitation for all of us to share what we know. That was a magic moment, because what would happen at that point is that someone who had found the web or had been exposed to the web would share something they'd found with someone who hadn't heard of even the web. And that person would then take a look at the web and see what this person had shared, probably something they were both interested in. That didn't happen by accident, because the web was too obscure in the beginning. It happened because someone wanted to share something they were passionate about. They shared that enthusiasm with someone else. If you can remember the first time that you probably had an experience with the web, it was probably someone sharing something with you. Might have been a cat picture, might have been the dancing baby, might have been something else that you were passionate about. You use it to share your enthusiasm. And when you share that enthusiasm, when you share knowledge, it's good for the relationship between the two of you. In other words, it reinforces the social bond, but when you share knowledge with someone else, you're helping to increase their capacity. You're actually helping them do better at what they do. And so what happened was, pretty much over the next 5 years, and most of us in the room will remember those 5 years when everything just started getting sucked into the web. Do you remember why we were doing it? It's a good question to ask at this point in time. What possessed us? What made the web so exciting that we couldn't do anything except spend our time either surfing the web or creating new content for the web? What was so exciting about it? It was tickling something really deep inside of us. It was really helping us not just to see ourselves, but as we were surfing these pages and seeing more, we were learning more. Because what we were learning was all of this other information that was in other heads that was coming up on the web. So it became a giant machine for helping us share with one another and to share our capacities with one another, and then through that to be able to increase our capacities. Because when you learn something from someone, when someone has shared something that they know onto a web page and you come and you learn that, you have increased your own capacities. And so what we do is we get this now 20-year period of dramatically increasing capacities, and somewhere in those 20 years our capacities increased to such a degree that again we broke pub trivia. So the web's now become this default platform for sharing experience, right? We don't even think about it anymore. It's almost become invisible. It's just kind of there. It's almost like it's, I don't know, like electricity in the background. We don't think about electricity until electricity goes out, and you don't think about how important your mobile phone is until you're in a black spot. And then you're like, oh my God, what's going on? What this means is that now, none of us, and probably for the rest of the time, are ever really alone with what we know in our own heads. We're always carrying a couple of billion other people around with us that we can refer to in pretty much any situation that we want. And this is something that we now need to start to think about, not just as something that's happened to us as people, but something that has to happen to us as organizations. One of the things that I do when I work, not just as a futurist, but as a consultant, is that I invite organizations to have a really good think about how they share their enormous resources of knowledge and experience. Organizations of any scale have hundreds or thousands of people, all of whom have amazing experiences, in-depth experiences around customers, around processes, around history. And most of the time, that experience isn't really exposed to everyone else in the organization. It's almost as if everyone in that organization is just flying with their own experience. And maybe we now need to start to think about broadening that out so that everyone in the organization is flying around not just with their own experience and their own capacity, but the experience and the capacities of everyone else in the organization. And there's no huge shift in that beyond a shift in how we think. We need to think now, just as we work in this world where we broke pub trivia because we now have access to so much information, that can translate not just to our day-to-day lives, but it translates to our organizational lives. Within a generation, Every business at scale is going to be a business that shares what it knows and learns from what it shares. Every business. Because businesses that don't do that will be run into the ground by the businesses that work that out. So we're pretty much now on a treadmill of learning. We're on a treadmill of getting smarter, because that treadmill is the thing that leads us into the capacities that we need to stay relevant. Okay, so over the last 20 years, we have been learning a lot about how to learn from one another. We now have this vast World Wide Web. The last time I checked, and I did run a check at the beginning of April, somewhere around 80 trillion web pages out there in the world now. So we've been learning from one another and these 80 trillion web pages. We've also, at the same time, been getting our heads around something else. We aren't just learning from one another. We're now actually starting to learn how we learn. And you think about that, what do you mean, learning how to learn? Of course, it's obvious that we know how we learn. Well, I am here to tell you that, in fact, although that sounds obvious, although it sounds like, well, of course we understand how we learn, we barely understand how we learn. And we didn't learn that we didn't know how we learned until we tried to teach machines to learn. So artificial intelligence, which is a big buzzword these days. Artificial intelligence has been around for 60 years. The first major papers on artificial intelligence date from 1955. This is Marvin Minsky, who's one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, playing with a machine that's trying to be intelligent in around 1965. And in 1965, if you ask these folks, when are we going to have smart computers? Oh, yeah, 5 years, 10 years, easy, not going to be a problem. And it was only when they tried to make these computers smart and they tried to teach these computers things that they realized that not only did they not know how to do that, they didn't know how we did it. And this is a really interesting point, because it wasn't until we tried to teach something that didn't already know how to learn, that we didn't see that we didn't know how we learn. But for 100 years, we've actually been studying how children learn. So you think children learn in the classroom? That's true to some degree. But in fact, what's really important here is that pretty much from the moment a child is born, they are the best, most dedicated scientist in the world. Every child, every moment of their lives is out there in the world running experiments. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? Oh, that's what this makes this happen. And what they're doing is they're learning the rules of the world by playing in that world. And through that play, through that experimenting, and that experimenting is unceasing, that's how they learn the rules of the world. And it took until basically around 10 years ago for the penny to drop, going, oh, if that's the way that we learn, and that's the way that we learn about the world, maybe we could start to take those same principles and apply them to machines so that we could get machines learning this way. We can do this now where we couldn't do it in the 1960s because we have some understanding maybe, but also because computers are an awful lot faster than they used to be. This is just over the last 20 years, because of something called Moore's Law. A computer is 1,000 times faster than it was 20 years ago. That's why you can have a really powerful computer in your pocket, only we call it a smartphone. But that smartphone is more powerful than a supercomputer that you could buy for $1 million 20 years ago. And for those of you who were working in the industry 20 years ago, you're all like, yep, you're absolutely right about that. So this law is at work now, not just on your smartphone, but on all of this work on teaching machines how to learn, on what we call machine learning. What I want to do is I want to take a look at two examples from Australian startups about how machine learning is transforming business process, because I want to take this thread about how we're learning how to learn and now tie it into what it's going to do about being disruptive with business. The first of these is a company called Premonition. Premonition is a startup that's based in Sydney. What does Premonition do? Premonition works with people who manage vehicle fleets. So it might be post offices, anyone who's got a fleet of vehicles out there. Every one of those vehicles has a driver in it. Every one of those drivers has a smartphone on them, because this is 2017 and that's the way the world works. Every smartphone has GPS on it. So every smartphone knows where it is. Premonition takes the information about where a vehicle is off the smartphone and feeds it into a machine learning system. And now Premonition knows where all of the vehicles are, and it knows where all of the vehicles have to go, and it knows about all of the traffic patterns because it's getting that information from another system, and it's using all of that information to come up with the best guess on how to route the vehicles around. And that's actually, in computer science terms, it's a really hard problem. It's called the traveling salesman problem. It's very hard to do. Only thing you can do is really approximate a good solution to it. But Premonition does its best with its machine learning system. This is what we think the vehicle should do right now. And then it sends commands out, or sends recommendations out to the drivers, and the drivers follow those recommendations. And if you use Premonition, what happens is you get about a 10 to 15% improvement in your vehicle fleet. And the only thing you had to do was basically put the Premonition app in all of your drivers' vehicles. Now there's another level here, because Premonition is making recommendations, but at the same time, Premonition is tracking the results of those recommendations. That's the key thing here. So not only is it learning from the information that's coming in, it's learning whether a given recommendation is a good recommendation or a bad recommendation. If it's a bad recommendation, it learns not to repeat the same mistake. If it's a good recommendation, it learns to reinforce that recommendation. And so what happens is the longer that you use Premonition, the smarter it gets, because it's learning from everything that the drivers are doing and learning from everything that it's doing. So what we have now is the layer of, this is just a service layer. This is just a little subscription service that basically any vehicle fleet company can sign up for. You just use this service, just add this thin layer of intelligence, and it's improving the process. This is the leading edge of a kind of optimization by machine learning that will become pervasive in business within 10 years. They're just proving that it works. Once they get it right here, once they can do this in these principles, they can start to apply it to other business processes. This is where it becomes not so much an issue of disruption, but can you always be using the best possible learning techniques? Do you have the right ways to learn so that your organization can continuously improve because it's using these techniques? All right, so that's one way we can use machine learning and these new techniques for teaching machines. There's another way, probably going to be more important in the long term. It's a startup that's out of Brisbane. They're getting a lot of attention right now. It's called Maxwell MRI. So Maxwell MRI is a machine learning system that's designed to be used by radiologists. And they're specifically working with the radiologists who are trying to identify patients who have early stage prostate cancer. Because as it turns out, that's not easy to do. You can't run a PSA test reliably for someone in early stage prostate cancer. You can't necessarily always image it well inside of an MRI. But it turns out that you can use a machine learning process to improve the quality of the diagnostic results. And so this now becomes a service that goes in the pipeline between the scan and the radiologist that helps the radiologist make the best possible determination. And so what you're doing is you're increasing the capacity of the radiologist to make a good decision. Once they get this sorted for prostate cancer, and they're in clinical trials for this right now, they plan on moving to breast cancer and to lung cancers, because the theory here is that the earlier that you can catch something, the more treatable it is. And they believe that with this technology, they will be able to significantly advance the detection and treatment of cancers. So this is something that's going to have a real impact on people's lives. Now, we've already seen quite a bit of machine learning showing up in medicine. A couple of years ago, IBM came out with Watson for oncology. Watson is their big machine learning system, cognitive computing they call it. And that was from January, where basically all of the best oncologists in Tokyo were stumped by a particular patient presenting. They'd never seen this type of cancer before, but because Watson has had exposure to something around 100,000 patient histories, which is more than any oncologist will see in an entire career, Watson was actually able to determine what cancer it was within 10 minutes when presented with the clinical symptoms being presented by the patient. So it's not so much that Watson is overriding the diagnosis. What it's doing is it's helping the oncologists inform the diagnosis. Now, when IBM was rolling this out as a product in 2014, I met with the salespeople, and I said, aren't the oncologists going to be freaked out that you're putting them out of work? What IBM said, I think, was very telling, and I think it sets the stage for where we're about to go. They said, our role is not to leave the oncologists unemployed. Our role is to be the quiet voice in the oncologist's ear. It's about helping the oncologist to do the best possible job all the time. And this is where you start to see what the real benefit of machine learning is. There are a lot of people out there who are telling you the machines are going to put us all out of work. Politely, that's bullshit. What the machines are going to do is they're going to help us get a lot better at what we do, and probably a fair bit more productive at what we do, because the machines are really good at learning, but they're not really good at any of the human skills. Now, machine learning isn't just a one-way street. It's not something that's only going to belong to organizations. In the next 10 years, you're going to start to see personal machine learning systems, personal AIs. We already sort of have the beginnings of them. Do any of you remember the Furby from 20 years ago? This was the hot toy in the world 20 years ago. And one of the reasons that kids love Furby is because, and it was faked, but it was faked really well, the more a child interacted with Furby, the more it would start using English and stop using Furbish, because it came with a little dictionary of its own language, Furbish. And so it seemed like the toy was learning English as the kid played with it, it was very clever. It's simply done, very, very clever. If we were making a Furby in 2017, it wouldn't look like that. It would look like Alexa. Maybe pretty and fuzzy, but it would look like Alexa. Alexa understands a lot of things that get said to it. Can't always do something, but it's this little box that sits in your home, listens to you in the background, and if you say, hey Alexa, I want you to tune in this radio station, or hey Alexa, order me a ton of fried shrimp to be delivered by drone tomorrow afternoon, Alexa can listen and understand. Why? Because Alexa isn't just listening to you, it's listening to millions of other people simultaneously, and it's trying to learn from every one of those interactions. And so the more people use Alexa, the more accurate it becomes. Siri is the same way, Google Assistant is the same way. This is kind of the face of what machine learning looks like from a personal, from an individual point of view in 2017. So that's kind of what it looks like. Now, what we're going to start to see is something that starts to get a lot more specific, a lot more about what our personal needs are. If premonition can use machine learning to increase the efficiency of a vehicle fleet, if Maxwell MRI can use machine learning to increase the accuracy of a cancer diagnosis, what's stopping us from using machine learning to help improve the quality of our lives or our capacity to earn a living? These are enormous opportunities. There are already startups working in this area, probably in stealth mode, who will be coming to market with these kinds of opportunities, because we're going to be using machine learning not just to make businesses run better, but to make our lives run better. And as soon as you say that's a thing, as soon as you say, well, it's not just on the business side of things where you're going to start to use machine learning, the world starts to get very weird and very interesting. Because what happens is you now have machine learning inside of organizations talking to machine learning inside of other organizations, talking to machine learning that's running interference for people. And so you have all of these different learning systems that are learning from all of the systems they're part of and from all of the people they're interacting with. All of those systems are going to start learning from one another. And by the way, that includes us too, because as I said, we've learned a lot about how to learn over the last 20 years. And so when premonition and your own personal machine learning system, when they get together and have a conversation and figure out how to collaborate so that you can reach your goals, that's going to be a different world. That's going to be a world that gets very smart, very fast. And the kind of transition that we just spent 20 years going through with the World Wide Web, where we all got really smart and really fast and managed to break pub trivia along the way, that's about to happen once again. But this time it's going to happen around learning, and around human learning, and around machine learning. Because it's going to be us, and it's going to be about what we know, and it's going to be about the machines, and it's going to be about what the machines know, and it's going to be about the organizations who have machines and what they know, talking to each other in every conceivable direction that makes sense. And we're going to be guided through that world by intelligence. Some of that intelligence is going to be us. Some of that intelligence is going to be our personal AIs. Some of that intelligence is going to be out in the world around us. And I know that this sounds a little weird today, but that's only because we don't have a full sense of what that world looks like yet. But I can tell you the way it's going to feel in terms of our experience of that world. It's going to feel a lot like having a trusted friend who's with you all of the time, that you're having a private conversation with. That conversation never begins, that conversation never ends, that conversation is continuous. And this sets the platform for what all forms of customer experience are going to look like by the end of the next decade. A little while with something like this, it'll be very hard for us to imagine what life was like before it. Don't believe me? Try to imagine what life would have been like before your smartphone. It's getting very hard to imagine what that horrible world was like. That voice helping us, easing our way in the world, leading to a continuous improvement in our own capacities to make the most of life, that's the real disruption that's coming. It's the thing that underlies everything else. It's the change that changes everything. And that's what organizations need to set their sights on. That's what they need to prepare for. It's what they need to build toward. Now, we're already a fair way there. We already have a huge structure for sharing and learning. It's already in place. Mostly we're using it to track our social lives. But sharing has more meaning than just watching what's going on Facebook. Facts have more meaning than just what you can find in Wikipedia to answer a trivia question. And so Where we need to start is we need to master sharing. We need to master sharing today, and we need to master sharing inside the organization. That is the key that unlocks everything else. Because you actually aren't going to be able to bring a machine intelligence into your organization and get it to learn until you've learned how to learn yourselves. So the bedrock of digital transformation is learning how to share. And when you do that, consider how you work with customers who are continuously becoming smarter or more capable, because they too are connected to smarter and more capable systems. And they're just as eager to share and to learn as you are. And they're just as eager to share and learn with you, so that you're both moving together. You need to do this because if you stay in place too long, what's going to happen is you're going to find your customers have run way out in front of you with their capacities, and most likely they will have run into the arms of another provider. So all of this is the way the world works in 10 years, but I need to throw one more element in there. It all comes with a really interesting degree of uncertainty. Something that we've only recently discovered is that we can get machine learning systems that excel at doing, for instance, certain types of medical diagnoses. We have systems now that can tell whether someone is headed for a mental health crisis long before a doctor can do that. When we ask the system why they know this, they can't tell you. They just know it. And it turns out that these diagnoses are incredibly correct. But the other side of the coin is that they seem to be so good that the machine itself can't tell you why, and so we're kind of left having to take these diagnoses on faith. We just have to trust that these systems work. We haven't actually built these machine learning systems with a capacity for self-awareness that would allow them to articulate why they have made a particular decision. And so the world that we're heading into, quote Steve Jobs, it's just going to work. You know, it just works. But we won't necessarily always know why it works. And if that's a little weird and a little magical and a little spooky, I'm going to finish with a story that will tell you exactly how weird and spooky it is. So I went to the Consumer Electronics Show this year. And that's Jensen Huang. He's the founder of NVIDIA, which is normally known for making very powerful graphics cards for computers. But because the same chips can be used in machine learning systems, he's getting into machine learning in a big way. And I was in the room when he flashed this card around. And that card is a very, very powerful machine learning system that, because everything's cheap now, costs $1,000 and is meant to be plugged into any car that you want. They showed that off. And he said, out in front of the convention center, we've got a car. It's an Audi, because he's got a partnership with Audi. We popped that card into this Audi. We put a program into it that allowed it to learn. And then we put a human behind the wheel of that car. And we drove the car around for 48 hours. And now, the car knows how to drive. This isn't science fiction. That's already almost 6 months ago. And they had the car out in front of the convention center, and you could book yourself in to get a ride in a car that had taught itself how to drive. That's going to be the model of Audi that ships in 2021. That's already on their roadmap. That is the car that they're shipping. That's how good we are at learning and how good we are at teaching and building things that learn. And we're only just beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things as you were talking was I was thinking about Waze, which is a car traffic management app that is funny stuff. And so what happens is that it takes all of this data from a whole lot of users and says, hey, there's a crash on the I-95 up here. Why don't you take this shortcut through the suburbs? And people started to, out looking at schnauzer-looking clouds, started to then go, hey, there's all this traffic. And then they get on Waze now and say, there's a police car here, there's traffic in our street. And so Waze then says, hey, don't go down that track. And so they keep their neighbourhoods quiet. But now the algorithm's catching up saying, hey, that's a BS piece of data. It's interesting. That's what I thought about. What did you think about as Mark was talking? Could you please have a quick chat to your next door neighbour? Introduce yourself if you ate by yourself at lunchtime. Say good day and have a chat about what did you think about as Mark was talking about? What came to mind for you? And I'll check in a second. Rightio, let's disrupt you mid-sentence. It's a good place to disrupt. So if I could just have you back for a second. And Gareth at the back has got a microphone. Anyone feel compelled to ask a question, to provide a comment, to just make a statement, to add some value, to provide some counter thought? We have someone at the back here. Could you please tell us who you are?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Rachel Fernside from Allianz. The first thing that came to mind when you were talking about pub trivia was the assumption that everything on the internet is correct, so fake news.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And
so the question is if there's no one out there arbitering it, everyone's just chucking stuff on there, how can we believe what is out there? It becomes increasingly less reliable because you wonder, is this the truth?
And I guess that it's interesting because we've seen this all happen sort of collectively over 2016 and 2017. This is now the grown-up phase of the internet. If you think about a child doesn't know how to lie, and then they know how to lie and they're really bad at it. And then they learn how to lie and then they're good at it. And then that's a whole other conversation that parents have to have. That's kind of what we're seeing now. And so it's not that we can't build detection systems for truth in this. So I was just at the International Conference on the World Wide Web. It was held in Perth this year. And this is sort of all the core researchers. You have to see the amount of work that's going on, tying machine learning into can you tell whether things are true? Now, this has a very real impact. You saw a lot of, in fact, researchers from Baidu and Alibaba because people are selling fake goods on those sites and they want to be able to detect them. But it's also, is this a bot army that's trying to reflect bad information? So it's all this stuff. So what you can say is that if you can use technology to amplify untruth, as you can use technology in some ways to be able to counter that. That is always going to be an arms race, and we just have to have to go with that. We also have to start to build a better sense in ourselves and in our culture about the degree of truth that's attached to any particular bit of information. When information was rare and scarce, it was harder to do, you could have rumor, but it was harder to do fake news because you simply didn't have a tool for it. Now that information is everywhere and overloaded, we have to really work on those questions differently. So you've hit the nail on the head. I think the answer isn't that it's a problem, it's just this is a quality of having a world with a lot of information in it.
Thanks, Rachel. I can see a 6-year-old saying fake news now. Anyone else? Gareth over here.
Dave Hines from Computershare. And I don't know if I'll articulate this right, but you know, where the knowledge, like where you finished up about this car could drive itself, and then I think before that you were talking about decisions that are getting made for you, but you don't really know how they're getting made for you. And then, you know, we're doing stuff in robotics ourselves in Computershare, and it's going to change the way jobs are done by certain people, and what does it leave behind about who's thinking about what things. Had BAs that knew how a process worked, and if the person that was the process worker wasn't doing it right, then you go to the BA and you go through the process and you work it out. It seems like this stuff's going to get further and further away from us understanding what the hell's going on and why things happen the way they are. And what does that mean? Like, who do you blame then, or where do you go? I mean, where's the throat to choke? There, mate.
But I think this is the whole argument for why we're not going to be thrown out of work by the robots, because there's probably going to be a whole new class of professionals who try to figure out what the robots are doing and why they're doing it. All right, so it's which is kind of the equivalent of a BA, except BA works from process to product, what's going to happen is the new BA is going to be working from product back into process, probably. And so for precisely those reasons, because when these systems get sufficiently weird and interconnected and malfunction, we're going to need to be able to sort of open things up and figure out what's going on. Well, we don't know how our electricity is being generated most of the time, and we're fine with that. So I think at a certain level, cultures are fine with a level of complexity that they can't see. It's going to be around, can we maintain that, right? Because it's not clear that the machines will necessarily, certainly in the short term, know enough to keep things in some sort of maintainable state. You know, we have a more supervisory role, a more advisory role. It was pointed out when we were talking about anyone who's ever flown on an Airbus. Airbuses, pilots are there if things go wrong. That's pretty much the only things they do, right? They don't take off, they don't land, the whole thing is an automated system. The pilots are there when things go wrong because they're the ones who can handle that. And in some ways, I think that's kind of where we're going in this civilization. So you hit the nail on the head. In fact, what you're describing is probably a new class of job.
So let's continue this discussion over a quick break while we set up our panel discussion. And I invite you to then think about that disruption where you've got this counter trend to what happens. And for the people that play pub trivia not to win but just to drink frothies, what will happen then? Because there's this counter trend around what customers want and customer experiences, which is where we're going to go after our next break.